So today is our sixth session of the Long COVID Plus conversations, and we have a very great speaker here today, Dr. Vivek Bhatt, who is a clinical assistant professor specializing in international and comparative law, human rights, and global legal issues. Dr. Bhatt holds a PhD in law from the University of Edinburgh, where he was an Edinburgh Global Research Scholar and held the Edinburgh College of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences Research Scholarship. His research focuses on international law and policy responses to terrorism, health crisis, and food insecurity. His work has been included in leading publications, including the Journal of Human Rights Practice and the forthcoming Oxford Handbook on Economic and Social Rights. Dr. Bhatt is a contributing editor of Opinio Juris, the world's most widely read international law blog, and he has previously consulted with the UK government on the human rights dimensions of UK health and immigration policies. And today he will speak about long COVID in children from the perspective of human rights. I'm very glad that you are here, Vivek, and please begin your presentation.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me as well, and letting me present my work as part of this very important series of talks that you are organizing. It's a pleasure to be here. As you now know, I'll be speaking today about long COVID among children, and specifically we'll be doing so from the perspective of international human rights law. This presentation is based upon a research project that I developed mostly while I was living in the United Kingdom, which of course is no longer the case, while I was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Essex Human Rights Centre. And it was research that I then continued on and carried out while I was living briefly in Utrecht and then back in the UK at the University of Aberdeen as well. So with that in mind, I am speaking about long COVID among children primarily from a UK perspective. I'm going to begin today by sort of explaining the magnitude of the issue of long COVID among children. And I do so specifically with the intention to highlight how prevalent this issue is, and also to draw attention to the fact that it's an issue that is not being taken at a law and policy level particularly seriously. We generally, when we think about long COVID in policy and law circles, tend to think of it more as a condition that affects adults when health-related laws and policies are being made. So I'm going to provide some of the UK context there before I talk about long COVID and children's rights more generally. Now, what you'll notice when I start talking about long COVID and children's rights is that I'm talking largely about rights that we consider to be universal, whether we're talking philosophically about human rights or whether we're talking legally about human rights in terms of the rights that are recognized and protected under international human rights law. These are universal rights or nearly universally accepted rights that are affected by long COVID when it affects children. So I will talk a little through those rights from a human rights law perspective. I will try to explain these laws and legal frameworks in a way that is accessible regardless of the level of legal expertise and knowledge among our audience members. I want to then speak a little more generally about equality and non-discrimination issues as well, and specifically about the fact that children from disadvantaged and marginalized communities tend to be those worst affected by and most likely to suffer from long COVID. And so there are specific non-discrimination related issues here. Again, I focus slightly on a UK perspective there, but much of the UK's non-discrimination law is, of course, derived from the European Convention on Human Rights, which will be of relevance to much of the audience of this talk as well. Lastly, I am based in the United States now, and so I do want to address just briefly the US perspective on long COVID among children. Healthcare and disability policies are made very differently in the United States of America, and the US is also slightly different to the UK and the Netherlands in terms of the international human rights frameworks with which it engages. So I'll bring in the US perspective just to highlight the fact that when we approach this issue from an international perspective, we also come across significant challenges as to the relevance and importance and the utility of the language of human rights in being able to talk about long COVID and how it affects children. So, in order to think about long COVID in children in the UK, it's helpful, I think, to take a step back first and think about COVID policies relating to children in the United Kingdom, because obviously there is a strong correlation and link between the two. Policy responses to COVID in children in the United Kingdom were very varied over the course of the pandemic. At times, children were very much treated as vectors of transmission of COVID. They were considered essentially risks, flight risks, if you will, in terms of the health risks that they posed to the United Kingdom's adult and elderly population in particular. So, for a period in the pandemic, we saw children banned from supermarkets. And of course, as we all know, high rates of transmission of COVID within schools and subsequent child to parent transmission led to very lengthy school closures. In the United Kingdom, some of these school closures were among the longest anywhere in the world in response to COVID-19. At the same time, we also saw children being deprioritized in later policy responses to COVID-19. I call this in my paper on the topic, and I draw on other literature on COVID among children to call this a kind of childist approach to COVID among children. This idea that children are still human becomings as opposed to human beings. So what we really saw as it emerged that there were low rates of hospitalization and death among children in the UK resulting from COVID-19, there was a total abandonment of measures like testing, tracing, and isolation requirements among school children. And this led to an increased risk, of course, of exposure to COVID. There was a deliberate policy of allowing COVID to spread among children and within schools in the United Kingdom. Now, of course, here we see the emergence of this correlation, this dynamic between COVID-19 and long COVID, because as schools were told to abandon testing, tracing, and isolation requirements, and these rates of exposure to COVID-19 increased, there was, of course, a natural then increase in the development of long COVID among children. We also saw in the United Kingdom, within a similar vein, a very slow vaccination among children. The vaccination campaign within the United Kingdom began among the elderly population with very good reason, but then was extraordinarily slow among children as well. So we see in the development of law and policy in the United Kingdom this kind of childist approach, which I problematize in my paper on this topic. This idea that children are at times treated as a risk to the adult population in terms of public health policy, and at other times they are deprioritized because they're not seen as being at risk of developing severe health conditions as a result of the spread of COVID-19. And this kind of dualism within the childist approach to COVID-19 in children has then subsequently informed the approaches, unfortunately, that we've seen to long COVID in children as well. Now, in order to understand why long COVID is as prevalent among children in the UK as it is, it's important to know that for lengthy periods of time in the United Kingdom, children were testing positive at a much faster rate than any other group in the United Kingdom population was for COVID-19. That is much on the previous slide as I talked about information about hospitalization and death being particularly low among children resulting from COVID-19. Testing for COVID itself, testing positive, was occurring at a much faster rate among children than it was in any other population group in the United Kingdom. And we, of course, saw that anywhere between 14 and 50% of children in the United Kingdom who tested positive for COVID later developed long COVID symptoms. So we have extremely high rates of positive tests for COVID among children. And then anywhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 2 children in the United Kingdom developing long COVID symptoms. And these studies also demonstrate that long COVID symptoms seem to develop among children at this rate without any correlation with the severity of their COVID illness itself. That even children with very mild COVID illness then went on to develop very strong, in some instances, long COVID symptoms that were, for many, debilitating and continue to be. So we then saw the beginnings of collection of data on long COVID in children, the kind of beginnings of research into the prevalence and the effects of this condition. In 2022, it was estimated that 115,000 children were living with long COVID symptoms in the United Kingdom. And in 2023, there were an estimated 77,000 children living with long COVID symptoms. Um, Unfortunately, there have been no statistics collected in the United Kingdom since the middle of 2023. So we are now close to 2 years into a total dearth of statistics on the extent to which long COVID continues to affect children in the United Kingdom, even though we know that there have been multiple surges and new variants of COVID itself in the United Kingdom. So we remain aware of the fact that long COVID is a very significant issue in the United Kingdom, but in many ways we aren't quite sure at this point of how prevalent long COVID is among children. Now, one note that I want to bring up on that front as I begin to talk about human rights is that in many ways, these conversations that we have around statistics can be misleading from a human rights perspective. When we talk human rights law talk, we of course know that the greater the number of people that are affected by a human rights issue, the more likely it is that that issue will attract attention and will then lead to policy change. But at the same time, from a philosophical perspective, even a significant violation of the human rights of one individual is a pertinent issue that needs to be addressed and that we need to be aware of. But we do know that long COVID affects a very large part of the United Kingdom's children population. And we also know that the COVID pandemic itself had significant and lasting impacts on children's capacity to exercise their human rights. So again, we see this dovetailing between COVID-19 and then the lasting issue of long COVID now. We saw during the COVID pandemic and especially during the lockdowns that children became much higher in likelihood to be exposed to domestic violence due to lockdowns and isolation with families in which there were histories of domestic violence. We saw extensive disruption to education for children during the COVID lockdowns. We also saw during the lockdowns that children in joint custodial arrangements experienced extreme precarity due to travel and household mixing restrictions within the United Kingdom. And these had long-term developmental implications for many children. And we also saw that many children were exposed to the loss of a family member or the prospect of such a loss for the very first time in their lives during the peak of the pandemic. So we see just from analysis of the implications of COVID-19 and the lockdown years on children's rights, that in many ways children have suffered a significant setback already just as a result of COVID-19 and the emotional and psychological and physical impacts of the COVID lockdowns. Now, the seriousness of these human rights implications that the COVID pandemic has had for children amplifies the need for us to consider long COVID from a child rights perspective. When we know that anywhere up to 50% of these very large numbers of children who have been infected by COVID in the United Kingdom continue to suffer debilitating symptoms as a result of long COVID. Now, when we think about the implications of long COVID for children's rights, I especially, but we in general think first and foremost about the international human rights treaties, which set out a global framework for the protection of human rights. These become legally binding upon countries, including the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, when these countries decide to sign and ratify these human rights treaties, when they accept the legal obligations that they set out. Now, children's rights are recognized in many international documents, but foremost in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is one of the most widely signed and ratified treaties, not only in the human rights treaties, but in the entire corpus of international law altogether. And both the United Kingdom and the Netherlands are both signatories of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, in the United Kingdom, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has also been embedded directly into the legal systems of Wales and Scotland, which have some lawmaking authorities under the UK's devolution settlements. And this means that in the United Kingdom, there are much higher levels of compliance demanded by these devolution settlements and the bespoke child rights embedding laws than elsewhere. So there are high standards of children's rights protected under the legal systems of Wales and Scotland in particular. Now, the first and most relevant article of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that is worth considering in relation to children's rights and long COVID is Article 24, which protects the right to the highest attainable standard of health for children. Now, each one of the UN human rights treaties has a treaty body attached to it that oversees the implementation of that treaty within countries that have signed and ratified it. And we know as a result of the jurisprudence of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, as well as the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, that the right to health under international law comprises various elements that are relevant to long COVID among children. The first element of the right to health that is relevant here is the right to community-based and preventive health care. This includes, as we know from the committee, behavioral and structural interventions, including the promotion of good hygiene, distancing, ventilation, testing, isolation, and also effective vaccination rollout among children. In the United Kingdom, there have been mixed reports from various studies that have been conducted on whether effective vaccination of children against COVID has been helpful in addressing or reducing the severity or longevity of long COVID symptoms. So the picture there is very mixed on the correlation there between vaccination and long COVID symptoms among children in the United Kingdom. But we know that this informal UK government policy of herd immunity among children that I spoke about earlier, this idea that long COVID was allowed to spread among school children, is inconsistent with this aspect of the right to health, this aspect of community-based and preventive health care. And thus, insofar as long COVID is a result of a failure to implement community-based and preventive healthcare measures in settings frequented by children like schools, the fact that children are now suffering from long COVID to the extent and on the scale to which they are in and of itself constitutes evidence of a breach of their human rights in the making of UK policies pertaining to COVID and long COVID. Another aspect of Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the right to health, is access to facilities for the treatment of illness and rehabilitation of health. This includes the availability of primary health care, which is the kind of front line of health care that will be accessed by any patient who needs medical attention. A front line like in the United Kingdom, prescribing nurses or prescribing pharmacists, but also then general practitioners as well. It also requires the state to provide quality treatment for long COVID that is based upon rigorous scientific research. And this here is an especially important part of the right to health in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as relates to long COVID among children, is the rigorous scientific research element. And I say that in particular because there have been dropping levels of funding for and support for in terms of the frameworks available for scientific research into long COVID among children in the United Kingdom. Now, in human rights law, we talk about the indivisibility of human rights. We have a concept that no one human right can be enjoyed in isolation from all others, and that a breach of one human rights violation will often see a breach of other human rights or broader implications for the enjoyment of other human rights. And we see that, of course, in long COVID among children as well. The fact that long COVID has such significant implications for children's health. The fact that it prevents many children from participating in their education, from attending school altogether, from having social lives or familial lives that might be fulfilling. This means that the health implications of long COVID for children also have broader implications for the enjoyment of their human rights. So it's also important to think of long COVID among children as an issue for the enjoyment of the right to education, which is also protected under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, one of the foremost rights that is protected under that convention is the right of children to participate in all decisions that affect them. Now, we see multiple issues on this front in long COVID among children. Firstly, we see that children have not been involved in consultative processes relating to the development of policy around long COVID in the United Kingdom. In fact, there have been very few consultative processes altogether, but those that have occurred have generally not included children at all. So specifically in long COVID, policy and law circles, we see that children have been marginalized in the making of laws and policies that have implications for them. But then, as a knock-on effect as well, we see that if long COVID has developmental and psychological impacts upon children, then their ability to participate in political processes in general, their ability to participate in the processes of decisions relating to electoral policy, for example, decisions relating to educational policy. These participatory rights are significantly infringed by the extent to which children are suffering from long COVID. We also have, under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 27, protections for the right of children to live in conditions that are sufficient for their physical, spiritual, mental, and moral development. And this includes the ability to establish and develop relationships with other human beings. This is similar to many readings of the European Convention on the Human Rights as protection for the right to a private and family life. It is this idea under human rights law that all individuals, and in this context, specifically children, have a right to establish and develop friendships and familial relationships that are conducive to their development and also to their emotional fulfillment. Now, insofar as children are suffering from brain fog, from debilitating fatigue, long COVID significantly affects their ability to live lives in which they can establish and develop these relationships, a right that is protected under this key piece of international human rights law. As I said earlier on, we also have studies in the United Kingdom that show that long COVID has disproportionately affected and continues to disproportionately affect socioeconomically disadvantaged people. People like those with underlying health conditions like obesity and diabetes, those living in underserved communities, individuals from minoritized ethnic groups as well. Now, international and UK domestic law, the Human Rights Act, which obviously implemented the European Convention on Human Rights, all require public authorities to develop an approach to long COVID in children that is firmly rooted in equality and non-discrimination. Now, this first and foremost will again include rigorous scientific research into how long COVID affects persons with protected characteristics. and if medically it has specific and differential impacts upon these individuals. It also involves training for healthcare professionals to ensure the most effective possible healthcare for children, long COVID patients with disabilities or linguistic disadvantage or underlying health conditions as well. Another aspect as well for equalities and non-discrimination, by the way, is reasonable accommodation for children with long COVID in school and educational settings as well. And there have been movements toward the recognition of long COVID as a disability within the United Kingdom and in parts of the US toward that specific end, that there will then be reasonable accommodation for children with long COVID in settings like schools. And on that note, I will conclude with a brief comment on the US perspective on long COVID among children as well. There have been some studies in the United States that show that long COVID is as widespread among children here as it is in the United Kingdom and indeed in the Netherlands as well. Um, and in America, the conversations become a lot more difficult because the US has not signed the International Covenant on Socioeconomic and Cultural Rights, which protects the right to health at the most general level, the right to health for the whole population. And though it has signed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the United States has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which means that it isn't bound by every single provision of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child directly under international law. This makes conversations for us as human rights lawyer about long COVID and its effects on children's rights difficult in the US context, because the US isn't fully engaged with the international human rights frameworks around children's health care. Many relevant policies in the United States are made on a state-by-state basis, and that includes reasonable accommodation for children with disabilities. So that in America is policy that is made on a state-by-state basis and even implemented on a local government basis. Some parts of the United States, like New York, have very robust human rights policies when it comes to the accommodation of children who have specific needs in their education arising from long COVID. But what this does from a human rights perspective is it creates what we call a postcard lottery, that the extent to which children receive treatment for and accommodation upon the basis of their long COVID varies quite dramatically depending on where you're looking in the United States of America. And that is obviously being compounded right now with some uncertainty as to the stability of federal funding for both healthcare programs and health-related research in the United States of America. So I will leave it there. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to any questions and discussions as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Vivek. That's a very interesting and also important talk, I think. Janine, do you want to ask a question first, or shall I kick off? I think I will begin. Oh, here you are, Janine. Je moet jezelf even unmuten. You're still muted. I will. We kunnen je nu niet horen, want je staat nog op mute. Maar je mag ook in de chat typen als als het niet lukt met het geluid aanzetten. I told Janine to write in the chat.
Sure.
It doesn't work with the sound.
Microphone.
Maybe I should go first then. Oh, they don't have questions yet, but if you have questions later, please join. And she says thank you very much. So what I'm thinking about is that you're sketching the human rights violations, and you're also sketching the ideal situation or more ideal situation. But what are the steps that governments should now take in order to improve the situation for children with long COVID? And I'm asking this because I think that in many ways, the human rights of children aren't totally recognized anyway. For example, how do you how did you phrase it? The participation in decisions that concern them is very often not happening. And I think that, for example, in the context of the climate crisis, this is also a very big problem when it comes to children and human rights. And of course, in the context of long COVID, this is more difficult because of the long COVID. Yes, I'm wondering how you see this, the movement or the transition from the current status to a better place, and also the role that human rights can play in that.
Absolutely. I think you've already hit the nail on the head by drawing out in particular participatory rights. And you are absolutely right that this is difficult in the context of long COVID. And it is in general in healthcare policy making. One of the very first steps from a human rights perspective that needs to be taken, as I said, is just rigorous scientific research to understand how exactly long COVID is affecting children, to continue collecting data, which is a task that has all but been abandoned. So the very first step is just to undertake this research. How many children are being affected by long COVID, and how exactly is it affecting children? Now, that will inevitably involve engagement with children to understand. And this can be difficult because children in general are known to struggle to articulate symptoms that they are suffering from, for no fault of their own, but purely because they are young and they don't have the lexicon, the linguistic toolkit available to them yet to be able to identify and understand their symptoms and then articulate them in a way that might be helpful in research contexts. But of course, this isn't the first time that we are seeking to understand a widespread health issue that affects children. Techniques for engaging children in processes of research around public health issues. This is something that's been done before and has been around for a while. And so these techniques can be understood by the state and implemented and deployed by the state in order to first understand how significant is this issue and how exactly is it affecting children. Right now, a lot of that knowledge is coming, for example, from qualitative studies among academics, for example, where we are hearing stories through interviews with parents, for example, about how their children are suffering from long COVID. But the understanding needs to be more systematic and needs to be developed by the state through scientific research. There then need to be a number of things. On the education front, we do need to think a little bit about disabilities and non-discrimination. It is really, really vital that long COVID is consistently around as much of the world as possible recognized as a disability. Because once long COVID is recognized as a disability in most jurisdictions, that is going to see obligations kick in among educational providers, healthcare providers, employers when children are getting to the age where they might be seeking employment or internships, what have you, that their needs are accommodated upon the basis of their long COVID. And so that's a really, really important step within all of this. And particularly important, as I said before, because many of these children who are suffering from long COVID also went through 1 or 2 or 3 years of homeschooling as well. So they've already been set back in terms of cognitive development, emotional development, socialization, and just being able to participate fully in their education as well. So there are a lot of issues there to be addressed. And then, of course, the third prong to all of this is under the right to health, under Article 24 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and specifically the development of tailored health interventions and responses and treatment facilities that are specifically targeted at children who are suffering from long COVID. Now, what those treatments and treatment facilities need to look like will completely depend on what is found in this process of understanding and research as well. But we definitely do know that the development of healthcare facilities for children with long COVID has not been extensive really anywhere in the world that I've looked so far.
Yeah, thank you. So, how do you feel about reparations? Because I think that it's this is such a big injustice for so many children that, and also during the COVID pandemic, the different forms of discrimination that you lined out, of course, affected many more children than only those who got long COVID. So yeah, it's in terms of justice, I think that the community should be concerned about yeah, some form of reparations.
Yeah.
But
Under international human rights law, we say that victims of gross human rights violations have a right to a remedy, which goes exactly to what you're talking about. Now, generally, when we talk about the right to a remedy in human rights law, we're thinking about sort of gross violations that have been committed by the state, often or even generally in the form of sort of targeted violence, for example. But the point that you're making stands in the sense that this is a significant injustice that has been suffered by and is being suffered by children who are suffering from long COVID, and then also their families and their friends who are affected by this. And so there are questions to be asked about what remedies can look like. Now, obviously, when we talk about legal remedies, a lot of what we discuss is to sort of the law tries to find remedies and reparations that will restore the individual that has suffered an injustice to the state that they would have been in had they never suffered the injustice. Now, in the case of long COVID, we sort of don't know if that is possible. It
mm,
does seem to be the case from research that has been conducted that the severity of long COVID symptoms in many people who suffer from long COVID does tend to decrease over time. That the long COVID symptoms over time do get weaker, but not for everyone. And particularly in children, we are seeing that many children are suffering from debilitating long COVID symptoms many, many years after they were infected. So this question of kind of restoring children to the state that they would have been in had this never have happened is maybe not a relevant one to be asked. And I think that what else reparations can look like is a conversation that needs to involve children
mm.
who are suffering from long COVID and their families as well. It doesn't, it doesn't strike one as a situation in which monetary compensation is what is going to bring justice for these children and those closest to them. So discussions around reparations also need to involve the participation of these children and where relevant, their families as well.
Yeah, definitely. And also, but perhaps in terms of research and money that goes to research, there is, of course, a strong reason to invest much more money into that also for this reason, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, yeah, something else that I wanted to ask you about before we began this meeting, you briefly mentioned that you also did some research into care homes for elderly people.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you see any parallels between these groups in terms of human rights violations in the context of COVID, because of course these are quite vulnerable groups that depend on others, both children and elderly people in care homes more strongly than many adults. So could you perhaps say something about that?
It's a great question. And I mean, you're a philosopher, I'm a human rights law person, so maybe there's a parallel between both of our thinking in this. One of the things that the COVID pandemic triggered for me and my thinking about human rights was that it made me think much more carefully about how society treats vulnerable people in times of crisis, and how quickly society can turn its back on or dismiss the needs of vulnerable members of society as well. And I definitely see certain parallels between how the elderly community, particularly care home residents, were treated during COVID and how children were treated. One parallel that you see there is this idea of children being sort of a health risk of being this vector of transmission of COVID. We saw that with the elderly community at various points during COVID as well, and particularly the care home resident community in the United Kingdom. There was definitely this idea, not only that they were vulnerable to being infected with COVID, but also that they posed this risk that because they were living in care homes where there were these huge outbreaks of COVID, where it was really spreading at a rate that it wasn't in any other setting in the United Kingdom, that we began to just think of care homes like we did about schools, that they were just these settings in which COVID was rampant. Now, the rhetoric might have been slightly different with care homes, and that the government of Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom claimed that it had placed a protective ring, to quote directly, around care homes. They said that it was to protect care home residents. But when you drill down into that policy, it very much seemed to be one of just trying to seal that community off from the rest of the population in the United Kingdom, almost as a containment measure. So you see that. And then the other thing that you see as well is deprioritization in terms of policy. Now, in the vaccination campaign, we saw the opposite. So the vaccines genuinely did start with the elderly population in the United Kingdom. And firstly, with care home residents and those working in health and social care settings. So by the time we got to vaccination, we had reached this point where we realized that we needed to take care of those in care homes and those working with care homes. And children were vaccinated last because they were at the lowest risk of severe illness and hospitalization. But we also saw a kind of reverse deprioritization. So as the research project I was on continued on, we uncovered documents that ended up in the public domain and in the British press anyway, which suggested that elderly people were deliberately being deprioritized for intensive care treatment during the COVID pandemic. An elderly person who was a care home resident was less likely to receive intensive care treatment for COVID than a very ill person who just happened to be younger purely by virtue of the fact that they were an elderly person living in a care home. There were also reports that every care home resident in the United Kingdom during COVID had a do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation order placed on their medical records at the behest of local NHS trusts, largely out of fears that hospitals would just run out of facilities to treat people who are ill. So regardless of COVID infection, all care home residents were apparently having DNA CPR orders added to their medical records, and specifically without any consultation with the care home residents themselves or their family members if they lacked capacity. So you see here another parallel, which is the participatory rights and the consultative rights. The wishes of elderly people, and particularly those living in care homes, weren't systematically taken into consideration during the lockdown years, in the same way that the needs of children haven't been taken into consideration in the development of COVID and long COVID policy.
Yeah, I think the same situation was here in the Netherlands. I mean,
Yeah.
many people in care homes were also unable to receive visitors. So there was like a whole social isolation as well. And I think that, yes, in the context of taking care of the vulnerable, the COVID pandemic taught us some quite awful lessons that many people want to forget. But we see it now with long COVID patients in general as well, because they are now that vulnerable population that
Yeah.
can't really advocate for themselves. So it's the same logic. Um, uh, is there anything else that you would like to add to this conversation? What do you think? Because you already said that in terms of policy recommendations, we need better scientific research and so on. But in terms of uh, academic research or research into human rights, what would be important questions um, to investigate at this point in time? Because I feel that we are almost in this limbo kind of situation where the patients are in their homes waiting for something that doesn't really happen. So yeah, what kind of ways forward do you think are fruitful in academia and beyond?
I think in academia and beyond that as well, I think in particular in the synergies between academia and civil society, there is a need to galvanize this conversation and to try and center the experiences of children and adults suffering from long COVID. I think that you are right that we are in this limbo and that those who are suffering from long COVID are in their homes, either waiting for this to go away or for there to be effective policy responses. And society at large, lives under this assumption that we are through COVID, that we're past the COVID days, that they're sort of entirely behind us, which is perhaps psychologically an understandable response to the ordeal that society has gone through, but it does mean that there isn't much conversation happening at large around long COVID. And so I think that as academics, and particularly in working with, healthcare related NGOs, for example, or children's rights advocates, there are many organizations, both in the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, that do children's rights advocacy work specifically. We need to try and censor the stories of children who are suffering from long COVID and to try to highlight the severity of this condition. I think there are probably millions of people out there who just simply don't realize how severe long COVID can be for children. So I think that's very, very important for us to do. I think secondly, another thing that I'm noticing in academic circles right now as we talk about public health is that we're starting to think a lot about what's the next epidemic and what's the next pandemic and how can we be prepared. And these are extremely important conversations to have, but I think in many ways it can be very dangerous to think so hard about what the next crisis will be that we forget maybe a little bit that we have a crisis on our hands right now as well that we still need to be thinking about and addressing. So I also think that there's a kind of a rhetorical shift that needs to happen whereby we realize that part of being prepared for the next public health crisis is also just dealing with the very physical after effects of this crisis as well. It will not be beneficial to public health, the next epidemic or pandemic, if long COVID has not been addressed effectively and treated effectively as a condition. So, yeah.
Yes, of course, and there will be new patients with post-viral conditions following from that, and
Yeah.
also those who have long COVID now or had it and recovered will probably have a higher risk of again
Yes.
getting these post-viral illnesses. So I think especially for children, because this is something that I worry about a lot. Also, children who recovered from long COVID will probably be sensitive to ME and post-viral illnesses throughout their life. So there's a whole generation that is will be more sensitive to this. So
Yeah.
yes, good remarks. I completely agree with you. Well, thank you very much for being here today with us. Janine also says thank you very much for the for the interesting
Sure.
talk. And we will have the next long COVID conversation already next week. That's the first one in April. But we will send an email around to the group about that. Thanks a lot, Vivek, and I hope our paths will cross soon somewhere in the real world.
So do I. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Even kijken, where do I stop recording?